Today we are going to have exciting 3 weeks section with Professor Natalie Pan, and then she's going to share what actually new media in Singapore. And so I'm very excited to hear what she's going to share. And also now I think because it's the first section, I've actually introduced Dr. Pan many times to you about her role. So later on she will tell you more. And we have worked together for several years in the Nanyang University in Singapore. And she has done a great job in research and teaching and a wonderful collaborator. So that's why I'm very excited to hear more insights that she's going to share with us in class. So I think I will let her start, and maybe each of you can quickly tell Professor Pan who you are, and then shortly, and then we can kickstart the 3 sections. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. It's good to, great to meet all of you. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Trisha, for the exaggerated introduction. I don't deserve all the praise, but thanks, Trisha. I am really happy to be here and very excited to be doing this sharing with all of you and tell you more about how I guess the ecology of media and the introduction of media and its kind of implications. So I will be focusing largely on the context of Singapore, but before that, maybe just a bit of introduction about myself. At the moment, I am a senior lecturer at the Communications and New Media Department at the National University of Singapore. And I also work on a number of research projects that's under a different hat I wear at the Center for Trusted Internet and Community, where I am principal investigator there. So a lot of my research centers on new media and its sort of impacts on society. I'm also very interested in digital well-being and inclusion, topics of digital inclusion. Right now I have I have 2 active projects, one of which I collaborate with Trisha, Professor Trisha here, which is about I guess increased convergence of new media really also brings about greater data collection, greater concerns about data across various segments of society, right? So one of my project is looking at the various kinds of policies and cultures, attitudes towards the issue of data and the protection of data. I mean, I think Lucas, for you in Germany, this is something that's not new because in Europe, right, there's been a lot of work done by the European Union on things like GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Act. So another one of my project is looking at research concerning how vulnerable populations use digital media during what I describe as significant life transitions, right? Having someone fall ill, for instance, is a significant life transition for many older adults. Having to live alone or losing a job is a significant life transition, especially in the past COVID-19 year. So yeah, my other project is looking at digital media use. But yeah, I mean, other than that, every 4 to 5 years, I also do research on new media and the election. So that's been something that I've been studying since the mid 2000s. So yeah, I'm happy to be here. If all of you don't mind, I would like a quick introduction about yourself. Maybe you could, state your name and which institution you're from. I understand that all of you actually, I mean, except for those in the class, right? You come from different places. I'll be very interested to hear about where you're from and your interest in new media. I Maybe we can start with those online first, and then we can go to people in the room. Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay.
I can't really see all of you, but yeah, I am Sophia. I am actually a research apprentice working with Dr. Natalie on on the general elections in Singapore, as well as discourses of artificial intelligence. Yeah.
Artificial intelligence. Cool.
Okay, that's about it.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. Lucas?
All right, yeah, I'm Lucas. I'm from WHU, Otto Beisheim School of Management in Germany, close to Frankfurt or Cologne, if you know these cities, where all the old fairy tale castles are located. And my interest in new media, with Melissa together, we are looking into how Zoom and also Teams are used at universities currently during the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks. So your university use Zoom and Teams, right?
Yes,
Okay.
both.
Yeah. Thank you. And
Melissa.
Melissa?
Hello, so my name is Melissa. I'm from France, and I study management in a business school too. And I decided to know more about new media because I think it's an actual thing. Like, I don't know how to say it in English. But yes, it's actual.
Mm. I noticed, Melissa, you have a Chinese name next to your profile name.
Yes, I don't know why, and I can't.
Oh,
I don't
okay.
know how to change.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. I thought it's actually your Chinese name.
No, I don't have one.
No worries.
Maybe
Yeah.
the university assign both of you,
Oh,
distance.
yeah.
and
Lucas
stuff
as
like
well. Okay. Yeah, no worries. Okay. Yeah, and then maybe we can go around the room. People in the room.
that. You first.
Hi, my name is Ari Shaw. I'm from the Caribbean island of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I'm currently doing my undergrad in journalism, and I think that explains my interest in new media.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I have actually one slide on journalistic practice, so we can talk more about that in a while. And next.
Hi, Professor. I'm Esther and I'm from Malaysia.
Oh, okay. Which part of Malaysia?
It's around KL.
Okay.
Yeah.
I am actually half Malaysian, so if you tell me which part, I would know.
I'm from Selangor.
Oh, Selangor. Okay.
And I'm quite interested in social media apps. Yeah. Thank you.
Any particular apps?
Currently Clubhouse. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm on Clubhouse too.
Oh, wow. You
So come
opened the mic.
look for me. Yeah, I have. I didn't host any session on Clubhouse, but I participated as speaker on a couple of sessions before. So yeah, it's actually a really interesting platform. I'm learning a lot. Yeah, and I think the affordance is quite interesting. It uses only voice. So for those who are not aware, Clubhouse is a new app on social media. So it's an audio only platform. And yeah, basically when you join, you're able to join, like say, a room and hear people having a conversation on a topic. Right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And
Taiwan is quite popular right now. I think a couple months ago, and we have one like morning news, international news session in Chinese every 8 o'clock in the morning, and they won like a ranking is like the first on top in Taiwan, in Macau, in Hong Kong, and I think some Chinese speaking areas because they have the participatory journalism and people can actually talk about what's happening in Xinjiang, what's happening in Hong Kong or other places. And both of them actually is going to do a research project about Clubhouse. Yes.
oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think I guess we will get to this topic later, right? Which is that intersection between the affordances of the media and the sort of democratic culture of the country, right? So I mean, it's it's very interesting to hear that, yeah, Taiwan's actually Clubhouse is gaining a lot of prominence in Taiwan, and there are so many conversations there, but it doesn't surprise me at all. Right, because Taiwan always has this very democratic culture, right, compared to other parts of Asia. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, it's true. Fact, not opinion. And
Hi, I'm Lorna, and I used to be in the English department in my bachelor degree, and right now I'm in the IMIX program, the International Communication Master degree. And I'm very interested in new media, and especially video industry and entertainment industry. But I'm also very interested in the affordance zone. In this semester, I'm going to do the Clubhouse project on affordance asset with Esther.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I look forward to following your research in this area. Yeah, I haven't looked into research about Clubhouse, but just using it as a user, right? So I look forward to learning more. Okay, just to confirm that everyone can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, awesome. Okay. I will switch over to my screen now. So I can't really see myself right now, but if anything amiss, please let me know. Okay. Uh, Something with my face or what. Yeah. So I mean, I have prepared quite a number of slides to share with you, I guess, my various research and also experiences on the under the topic of new media ecology. But even as I go along, right? I mean, I given that this is such a small class, I don't want to be like boring all of you with a lecture, right? So please feel free to interrupt me, right? If you have a question or if you have a comment to make, right? Especially with some parts that I'm talking about, it's very much based on the context of Singapore. But there are learnings that we can extrapolate, right? Because Singapore has a very unique, I guess, socio-political system and culture here. But there are also many parts about Singapore that's actually aligned with the ways that many other Asian societies have developed. Especially its developmental goals in the 1980s and so on. So without further ado, maybe let me just jump right in. So this is basically, three things that I'll be covering, in terms of background, right? Because for me, to really understand media ecology and new media ecology, right, by the extension, it's absolutely essential that we understand the social historical background as well. So on that note, right, I will also begin, I guess, follow that with discussion of the sort of historical developments of media in Singapore. So maybe some definitions, right? When I talk about media, right, I refer to both content and its form. So media to me, it comprises not just the media content itself, right? As like the cultural goods and cultural products that we that's produced. Media is also the form, right? It is I guess it goes back to McLuhan's the medium is the message, right? So television, radio, even new media, right? They are all part of media. And the reason why I do believe that it's really important to not just jump straight to new media, but understand media as a whole. It's because new media cannot be seen as a standalone, right? It is a part of the media environment. It is a part of media ecology, right? Not just in Singapore, but very much a part of even globally, right? It is a new media is a part has to be understood, right, in the context of many other platforms, many other media content, right? That's also present elsewhere. So yeah, that's actually basically my outline for today, and we can go into various case studies under any of those umbrellas. Okay, so maybe some right. Can you hear me? Sorry, I stopped hearing echo. Okay.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Yeah. This is much better because I kept hearing echo just now. All right. So just some context, right? Singapore is very small, even much smaller than Taiwan. So if you can see the map, right? Taiwan is right here, right? On your sort of towards the middle, upper part of the middle, right, of this image, right? And then we have, of course, China, and as we go down south, right, that's pretty much Southeast Asia. So Singapore is a part of Southeast Asia, but culturally, Singapore also identify with East Asia, right? That's a cultural studies discussion that I will go into another day. But geographically, Singapore is a part of Southeast Asia. And being a part of Southeast Asia, right, it is actually surrounded by countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and yeah, even further up north, Thailand, and so on. As you can see, Singapore is also extremely small on the map, right? While you can see the rest of all the other countries I mentioned, you can't quite see Singapore, right? It's a red dot over here. And that is why Singapore has always referred to itself and been referred by many others as tiny red dots, because it's literally a red dot right on the map. You can't quite see it, and the population is also very small, about 5.8 million right now. And one thing I would say about Singapore population is it's also that it's actually very I guess cosmopolitan and diverse as well, because we do have quite a number of actually migrants who come from different parts of the world to work in Singapore. And this is actually by design and in many ways, which I'll go into in a bit, right? In terms of ethnicity, right? I guess, yeah, every country, every nation, state have its way of defining its identity. The way Singapore identified its identity is, yeah, or rather one of the ways, right, is by ethnicity. So there is what we call the CMIO framework. C stands for Chinese, M stands for Malay and Indian and others, right? It's called CMIO. What this implies is that on our identity card, right? And in many ways, I also believe that your identity card, right, is usually the way the nation state defines your national identity. So for every Singaporean who has an identity card, they need to have this ethnicity stated there, right? So of course, this has been contested in recent years as well, where yeah, there's been a number of individuals, a number of scholars that have come up to contest the sort of arbitrary categorization of this ethnicity, right? Because there's many others who also identify that even within Chinese or within Malays, there's also quite a number of different nuances, right? So in terms of language, yeah, English is actually the working language in Singapore and the official medium of instruction. So all schools, at all schools from primary school to up to, yeah, Institute of Higher Learning, English is the primary medium of instruction. But because of this ethnic identity that everyone has, right, there's also a sort of identified mother tongue, right? So if your ethnicity says Chinese on your identity card, it's also essential in school, right, that you learn Chinese, right? Of course, there are ways to drop the language, right, drop the subject, but yeah, there is a whole process that goes on. Now, let me talk about, going back to Singapore's position in the region, right? Let me talk about how Singapore has always been developing itself. I think many of you in the room would know that Singapore is a relatively young nation. We gained independence in 1965, 2 years after our separation from Malaysia, right? Actually, we got kicked out, but even before 1963, right? Singapore development as in the region has, even under the British, right, has always been something that's like a free port, right? It's always been by design that because of Singapore's position in the area, in the region, right? As you can see, it's actually right at the point where many trade routes, right? They will converge and they would pass. So it is actually a very popular place for ships to stop, right? So even in the past, before 1963, before the war and all that, Singapore has always been a port, right? For ships from India, right? If they are carrying spices, right? They will be to other parts of the world. They will be passing down, right? If you can see, India is actually on the left, right? They will be passing down this route, and they will pass by Singapore, stop for supplies, and move on. So likewise, ships from other parts of the world as well. So Singapore's entire history, right, before everything else, has always been that of a colonial, commercial, military port, right? A lot of our development is dependent on this sort of geostrategic position, right? Which is at the point where many routes converge, right? Talking about convergence it's important, I think, to reflect how media convergence is also somewhat a convergence of places, right? So this is actually also why, as I will delve into later, this is also why Singapore has always, even in its approach to the development of media, had always this vision of Singapore being a media hub as well, right? In terms of political system, I think this is really important because how we use media is also dependent on the kinds of social-political environment we live in, right? I will use the way Freedom House describes Singapore as partly free. Let me elaborate why Singapore is partly free. In Singapore, there is, I guess, freedom to vote, right? There is a democracy. So this means that every 4 to 5 years, the parliament gets dissolved, and all, everyone, so long as you are a citizen in Singapore, you get to vote. You get to go to the ballot poll, right? And throw in a vote as to which party or which political candidate you want to represent you in parliament. So I guess on that note, there is universal suffrage, right? But in Singapore, there is firstly no freedom of assembly. So if people were to, I guess, decide to gather at Raffles City, right, with placards and all that, they will get arrested, right? They will be hauled to the police station. But there is one place where, and it is the only place where people can gather, can assemble, and have an organized protest, right? This is known as Speaker's Corner in Singapore, and this corner is also known as Hong Lim Park. So I guess for someone like me that studies internet-based mobilization, it's quite easy for me to do my research because I only have to go to one place, right? Where I know people will gather, because technically and legally there's no other place that people can gather, right? So there is no freedom of assembly, and that is why one of the key reasons why Freedom House describes Singapore as partly free and not completely free. Another reason is also the fact that Singapore's media is heavily regulated. So all media, right, including internet sites, right, they are regulated under the class licensing scheme. And also even the mainstream media, like broadcast media, I'm talking about the television, the newspaper, the radio, they are all sort of regulated under the Broadcasting Act, under the Media Development Authority. So there is because of these regulations, right? Singapore is partly free, right? On this note, right, all of you may like to check, your own country. I believe Taiwan is completely free, right? If I'm not wrong, under the Freedom House classification, is one of the few countries in Asia that's described as completely free, right? No other countries actually has that status in Asia, right? Even Hong Kong. I mean, let me talk about Hong Kong, who is also partly free under Freedom House labels, right? And Hong Kong is partly free for different reasons, right? They don't actually have the freedom to vote, right? There's no, I guess, universal suffrage, but in Hong Kong, there is a sort of a free press. Although we'll see how that develops, right, in the coming months and years. But in Hong Kong, there is also freedom of assembly as well. Yeah, but I think the situation in Hong Kong is still developing. So just some background, right, to Singapore. So let me actually talk about, on this note, now that you understand how Singapore has always envisioned itself as a hub, right? Let me move on to talking about its development of media. So I think if we can actually trace back to Singapore's former development as a media hub, this can probably be traced back to the 1980s, right? So yeah, this is about 10, 15 years after our independence, right? And there's really, I would say, two kinds of motivations here. One of it is domestic, and it's very much tied to Singapore's, I guess, at that time, at that point in time, right, recognition that they actually need the media to help them in nation building. And this is, I have included a quote here that I think is very, I guess, appropriate and reflective of Singapore's situation, right? And this is a quote by Benedict Anderson, Imagine Communities. Right, I did just a show of hands. How many of you know about the book or have read the book? No. Okay, so maybe I should explain. Benedict Anderson, Imagine Communities, right, is about how is in fact about the nation state. It's about how nation states actually imagines itself and how the processes, the resources they use to set boundaries, right, and also define its identity. So let me maybe just read out, given that many of you have not read the book, let me just read out actually one of the quotes from Benedict Anderson's Imagine Communities. I propose the following definition of the nation. It is an imagined political community and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. It is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. But yet in the minds of each lives, of each lives the image of their communion. Communities are to be distinguished not by their falsity, genuineness, but by the style in which they are imagined. Finally, the nation is imagined as a community because regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. Ultimately, it is this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many millions of people, not so much to kill as willing to die for such limited imaginings. So if you think about what Benedict Anderson is really saying is that every nation state, right, firstly, right, he's trying to say that it is imagined, right? The kinds of identity for every nation state is imagined because if you think of yourself as a citizen, right, it's hard for you to even really know most of your fellow citizens. And therefore, right, because you don't meet them or maybe you may not even hear of them, right? But yet in your minds, right, there is a certain imagination of what binds you together, right, as fellow citizens, right? So the question here is, how do nation states actually construct such imaginations, right? I will go to my next fun slide in a while to show you how, right, and how Singapore does it, right? So yeah, and going back to Singapore's development as a media hub, right? This is actually one of the domestic motivation. So if you can imagine, in 1965, when Singapore had to stand on its own 2 feet and form its own nation state, right? The rhetoric back then was this: how are we gonna survive, right? And actually, to this day, this survival rhetoric is still very present today, right? It's always been a narrative of survival rather than thriving, right? But that was the great question, right? Without natural resources, without a hinterland, how is Singapore gonna survive? Uh, there is like well, I can't stress enough, right, how important this uh, emphasis on survival really, or rather how significant it really is in actually translating in impacting many other policies later. But yeah, the threat back then was survival, and I mean, Singapore worked very quickly under the leadership of our past Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, who actually set up various policies, set up various bilateral and agreements, right, to ensure that the natural resources still gets delivered to Singapore, right? I always joke with my friends from overseas that, yeah, I mean, if Singapore people want to kind of attack Singapore, is actually relatively easy. You just cut off our water supply, and yeah, we will have to surrender, right? So how did Singapore survive, and not just survive but thrive, right, over the years? It's been a mixture of foreign as well as domestic strategies, right, on both ends, as well as a lot of I guess technological development and innovation as well. But in the I think in the 70s, when Singapore actually got out of the survival, right, the crisis of survival, it was really, I guess, in the mid to late 70s, right, that Singapore began to also, or rather the PAP-led government also began to be very aware of the need to, I guess, bring people together, the need to actually formulate a stronger sense of national identity, the need to actually pay attention, right, to the kinds of public discourse that were circulating about policies and so on. So this is where media comes in, right? Because media really, whether you are talking about newspapers or radio or even like TV program, right? Any kind of broadcast media, is not unique to Singapore, right? Just like many other parts of the world, a media, right, broadcast media really has a lot of influence, not just in terms of setting agenda, but they also can shape how people develop their understandings and discourse over various issues in the country, right? So there is actually this domestic motivation that was very present, and that really informed the way Singapore started developing itself in the 1980s, right? And of course, as extrinsically, right, going back to the vision as a hub, right? Singapore's early developments of media in Singapore, right, was actually aligned with the vision of developing Singapore as, again, it goes back to the port, right, that kind of will be at the forefront of facilitating the exchange of media, cultural goods, but at the same time also be influential in facilitating secure transmissions over or rather transmissions of messages that are highly secure, right, over reliable networks, telecommunications networks. So that's kind of the extrinsic motivation. Let me explain the first one first, right? Going back to my discussion of how the media actually plays that role in helping nation states actually imagine their community, right? I would like to, I guess, use a few examples, right? A lot of the examples I use here are from, TV drama examples, right? Because I mean, I was born in the 70s, right? So I literally grew up with this discourse shaping every part of my life, right? And also shaping my understanding of the Singapore identity. But of course, right, I must also caveat this discussion with the note that it wasn't just TV dramas, right, that were developed. There were also like concurrently a lot that was happening in the media scene in the 1980s, such as rediffusion, radio, right. Actually, I think Professor Trisha knows a lot more about radio than me. A lot of pop culture, right, that were actually developed as well. But let me just touch on a few actually TV dramas, right, that I think that were significant in shaping the national development discourse. Yeah. Okay. Let me talk about the first one, right? This is known as Army Days. I think the Chinese actually reads Xing Bing Xiao Zhuan, right? By the way, in Singapore, we use simplified Chinese, so all of these are in simplified Chinese. So why is this important, right? I think I highlighted this one as this is actually the first production in Singapore to feature national service in Singapore. I think this is the same in Taiwan, right? National service is compulsory. Is that right? Yeah. So no, it's not. Okay. Yeah. But in Singapore, national service for men is compulsory. So yeah, and if you look at this came out I think in 1983 and 1984, right? Where this TV drama, I think it had only 6 episodes or so, right? It featured national service in Singapore. It actually follows the story of one guy who got enlisted and went through all these like struggles, and it's a coming of age drama, right? But what's more significant, I think, is how it was the first local production to feature national service. The theme song was also used as one of the songs that was sang at the National Parade in the 1980s as well. So I think, I mean, I hope you see the connection. You see how the media content, right, the production was used to, sort of augment and reinforce the national development motivation and agenda. Okay, I will not go through all of them, but they're all really quite interesting. And the one on your right, is the Awakening. So it's called 雾锁南洋, right? And this was a 2-part series, right, that ran from 1983 to 1984. It featured 4 major stories. Firstly, the arrival of early Chinese migrants at the start of 20th century in Singapore. So it really, I guess, helped many I guess people in Singapore actually learn about I guess the development of the Chinese community in Singapore. It also featured the years when Singapore was under the Japanese, so the Japanese occupation from 1945 to 41 to 45, right? Independence of Singapore, right? It had the whole like Lee Kuan Yew crying on the TV scene after the separation from Malaysia, and later, the development of Singapore in the 70s and 80s. This was a hugely popular drama, but I think more importantly, it was also, I guess, it had many themes that resonated with people, right? Especially the older people who were born and had to live through those stories, right? Let me go to my next slide. And then we had actually quite a few of these that actually came up, right, alongside key developments in phases in Singapore. So in the 70s especially, and early parts throughout the 1980s, many people were actually still living in what they call kampongs, right? This is actually a Malay word that refer to like a village or the enclosure of a village, right? And people were kind of forced to move out of the kampongs they were living in and resettle in newly built public housing in Singapore. So Son of Pulau Tekong, right, which came out in 1985, featured stories that many Singaporeans actually really resonated with, having to leave their neighbors, live in a completely new environment, and also kind of marvel, right? As depicted in the drama, marvel at the developments. So that's one. And the other one is the coffee shop, right? Is Cafe U, right? And this is really also, if you look at the timing, right? It came right after Son of Pulau Tekong, which featured stories about moving out of the kampong. So here, the coffee shop is about living in the new housing, right? It featured like the everyday man, you know, the everyday man's aspiration of working hard and getting rich. Is about the Singapore dream, and everyday life living in these HDB estates. Last but not least, this is the Samsui women, right, on your right, right? It featured life stories of what we call Samsui women. I don't know if you have these in Taiwan, but in Singapore, the Samsui women, which we call Hong Tou Jing, right? It literally means they wrap their heads with red towels or red cloth. These Samsui women, many of them came from China. They came to Singapore to work, and they carried bricks, right? And they really help with the development and construction of many buildings and sites in Singapore. It's all related to industrialization, right? And this Samsui woman Hong Tou Jing, right, was featuring these life stories of women working in Singapore after the war, right? And I think what's also interesting is how if you watch the drama, it's about also their relations with motherland, right? And how they I guess deal with the challenge of wanting to return to motherland versus settling down in Singapore. So it's a very migrant story, right? And how they get naturalized as Singaporeans eventually, right? And have children that grew up in Singapore. So let me look at the time. Okay, I think you have a bit of time before your break. So let me, if you would indulge me a little, right? Let me play you the song, because I think for those of you who are Taiwanese, right, you may appreciate this song, because this is also a song that was sung by a Chinese singer, I think Chen Shuhua or something. I hope I didn't kill the pronunciation. Right, Chen Shuhua or Chen Shuhua, yeah. So this song was actually sang by her, and it won many awards back then. But the lyrics, right, for the benefit of those who don't read Chinese, the lyrics actually literally is talking about the Samsui women, I guess, nostalgia, wanting to return to motherland, and while actually living in Singapore and seeing like a new nation develop and recognizing their role in this development as well. Okay, so I hope you can see my screen. So the song is very nice. So you can go search for it. But I hope you managed to catch a glimpse of the content, right? It featured I guess Singapore in the 1970s and 80s, right? And towards the end, right? I kind of, let me just go to this part, right? Towards the end of the song, right? It will also show this contrast, right, between the forests that they were actually they had when they first arrived in Singapore, and the high-rise buildings, right? Short span of so this part. So the song is actually very rooted in the developmental actually milestones and discourse of Singapore. Okay, let me return to my slides, and thank you all for indulging me. And I hope you enjoy the song, right? Actually, for the Taiwanese in the room, have you all heard of this song before? I'm just curious. No. Okay. You know Chen Shuhua? Yeah, okay, good. At least you know Chen Shuhua. All right. Okay. Can you see my slides again? Thumbs up. Okay, good. Yeah, so this is just an open, I guess, sharing, right? I'd like to hear from you. If you can think of any cultural production that have shaped your understanding or experience as a citizen. Maybe you can think about that first, right? When you come back from the break, because I understand the bell's gonna ring soon. I will invite you to share, right? So Lucas and Melissa, please, and Sophia, please think of something as well. Sophia, I know you're Singaporean, but I'm sure your encounters will be very different from mine because we are from different generations. So feel free to come up with something as well. But let me go on to the other my other slides, right? Until the bell rings, then we can come back. Okay, so what about the external motivations? I guess I hope that you all see, right, how I showed that local media was really formed to help with this nation building, this developmental discourse about Singapore's development, especially in the 1970s and 80s and sort of early part of 90s, right? What about the external vision of Singapore as a port, right? Did it really becomes this free port of, or rather this media hub, right? Where lots of cultural goods are going to like be exchanged and all that. I think yes and no, because arguably that part is much harder to do, right? Given that, in not just in Southeast Asia, Singapore also had to contend with, I guess, competitors, right? Of media competitors coming from other countries. And Taiwan is one strong and fierce competitor, in fact, with the media industry being very actually rich and flourishing in places like Taiwan and Hong Kong. So, so I think in response, right, Singapore has been actually trying to reformulate, re-strategize in many ways. So, in 1994, right, yeah, the formation, the new organization, and this is a governmental organization agency called the Singapore Broadcasting Authority was formed, and this would later also become a regulator and promoter of Singapore broadcasting and in the internet industries. So SBA actually also became MDA, and which is still present today. So MDA, which stands for Media Development Authority, right, was formed through the merger of SBA and the Films and Publications Department, right? So going back to the theme on convergence in this module, I guess this is one area where we can see actually literally the convergence of many departments, right, and regulatory units, right, coming together because they recognize that they need to come together to come up with more coherent policies and regulations. So the MDA, right, in short, right, was actually it comprises, right, SBA, both SBA, which was looking after broadcasting, right, and the internet specifically, right, but MDA also took in the Films and Publications Department, which looks after like the regulations and dissemination of more news media as well as magazines and films, right? And SBA actually played a role in terms of, I mean, before SBA became MDA, right? And later under MDA, right? SBA actually played a role in terms of further developing this Singapore as a media hub vision into what they call a Media 21. So Media 21 has 6 key sort of strategic trusts, right? As you can see, the first one, right, establish Singapore as a media exchange, continued to be there, and this is, it has great resemblance with Singapore as a media hub in the 1980s vision. There was also I guess vision to export made by Singapore content. So this is really this trust, right, saw the development of, or rather efforts, right, to try to develop local creative talent and media talent. And I think yeah, you would see, right, because of this Media 21 vision, there were what should I call this? Right, trying to find the right appropriate word for it. Maybe okay. I'll just say that they are like the American Idol kind of contest, right? A creative search for creative talent contest. Looking for the next breakout star, looking for the next breakout singer, right? They were organized back then, right? And Media 21 also is very much, back then recognizing that digital media is going to be a key area of development. So arguably, yeah, I think Singapore recognized quite early, right, in the early part of 2000s that digital media was going to be a big thing that will form and inform the Singapore media cultural and media and cultural scene. And the fourth is about internationalizing media enterprises. Although I think, if we look back, on actually whether or not this has really happened a lot, I would say arguably not so much, right? And for various reasons, which I will get into after your break. And the fifth, right, it's about media talent. This is actually aligned with the second vision, right? The fifth vision is, or rather fifth strategic trust is to support the second one, because when they have actually media talent, they will produce made by Singapore content, which can be exported. And the sixth, I think, is also important because it is really about how they, I think, under the Media 21 vision, how Singapore wanted to open up the kinds of regulatory environments and business environments for media companies to come in. Trisha, are we okay for a break? The bell didn't ring, right? I can continue, right? Because I can't hear you, sorry.
It has run.
Oh, it has.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I should give everyone a break then. Sorry, I couldn't hear the bell. Let's go for a break and we can come back in 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you show the last slide with the question again?
It's activity, I think. The activity slides.
Yeah. So when you come back, I will get all of you to share, respond to my activity, right? I think people who are online, you can share your screen, but those who are not, you probably can't share your screen, but you can share with everyone about it, right? If you can't think of any, no worries. But if you're ready with your link or something to show us, you can use maybe the computer in front, right? But maybe while they get ready, can I invite those who are online to share first? Maybe Lucas?
Yes.
Yeah, I will stop sharing my screen.
I'm sharing YouTube link.
Okay.
So can you see my screen? Or
yes. Yep. Now we see ourselves.
Okay. So let me check to share the audio.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, so this was very famous in Germany. It was the movie is from recently, so I think 2 or 3 years back. But it kind of shows the German mentality of today. So it's a mix of the war is still defining most of Germany, and also the culture of rebuilding Germany and the humbleness, the efficiency, but also kind of shame and guilt of the war, and also now the multicultural society we are developing here in recent years. Yeah, this movie is like, let's say, at the beginning of all of it. So it still begins back in the war, but like nearly everyone here in Germany watched it, and it also made headlines in the in foreign countries, even though it's just such a local production. And it stars also like famous local actors and actresses. Yeah.
And Lucas, I'm just curious whether or not this was a movie, right? This was shown in the movie theaters and
Yeah,
all
a
that.
three-part movie actually. So
Three-part
3
movie.
times 1.5 hours.
Okay, wow. So and did you notice that like it changed, maybe shaped the way I mean Germany was discussing the war or even outside? I was wondering if you could
Yes.
comment on the affordances of like the film and the content a little bit.
Yes, so in Germany it was interpreted as very accurate and very describing of the past, what your grandparents, but maybe also your parents went through during the war. In foreign countries, there's also even a, I think, Chinese Mandarin Wikipedia article on it. At least here, the reception in Poland was very critical due to some scenes. So actually, they tried to forbid the movie there, to censor it, because they thought it's downplaying the role of Germany and shifting the guilt towards Poland. For those who don't have the history in mind, Germany invaded Poland as the first country in World War II. So there's still a lot of, some differences in between. Yeah, so that was the reception there.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah.
No problem.
Thanks. Okay, next, I think I see that people have been posting their links in the chat. Thank you very much. Esther, do you want to maybe, someone can help play the link that Esther shared, and Esther, you can do a quick sharing after it is done.
Esther, do you need help?
Hi, can you hear me, Professor?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I'm going to share the famous film of the director Zhou Qingyuan. It's the name is OLABOLA. So it's a story about Malaysian sports football. So I'm going to share this. It's because I think it's quite interesting that in this movie it shows that the different ethnicity in the film, like Malay, Chinese, Indian, and different kinds of people inside the movie, and how they work together to win the game. So I think it's very significant for the film. So I can show the trailer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What do you want to show? It's like the multi-ethnicity languages.
Yes, I think it is because it's about the different people that can work together when we have different backgrounds. I think it's not really common in
What's that noise? Who is crying?
Is it a trailer? Sorry.
No.
So I'm just thing I would like to share because it's a very touching movie for me. When I watched this film, I was like amazed by the storyline and how the characters work together. And I was thinking, whoa, wow, so Chinese and Malay and Indian, we can be friends. Yeah, I think it's just a little sharing from me. Yeah.
Okay. So, but is
Yeah.
that a reality or is a more utopian?
Yeah, I was gonna ask that.
I think it's an ideal situation in the film, but in reality, I don't think we can be so perfect. Yeah, but I think it's a good way to learn how they cooperate in the film. So it's the impact from the film, I think.
Yeah, and I think yeah, movies like that, right? They usually have very compelling, very powerful, very coherent storylines. Because it's a story, right? Which also I guess show the power of storytelling in terms of nation building and going back to the imagining community point I was making earlier, right? And the role of media. But yeah, I actually going back to Prof. Trisha's question, right? What is the reality like? I think it's actually something that we don't really know, right? But it was also, I guess, Anderson's point that for many people, they don't really know what's happening in their neighbors, even in their backyard, right? But the media is used to construct these imaginations for us. Yeah. Okay. Actually, in the interest of time, I won't go around the room and ask everyone to share, but maybe I will post this as an activity. All of you, you can just copy and paste whatever you have shared in the chat here, and I will ask you to like do a reflection question on it, right? Short one, right? Some of you already know what to say, right? Okay, let me get back to my slides, and thank you all very much for the sharing. I have a list of movies to check out this weekend. All right. Okay, I wanted to actually continue before you guys went for a break, right? Okay, wait. Just to check, y'all can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Before y'all went for a break, I was talking about yeah, how Singapore authorities, right, more like the developments in terms of policies as well as vision and the formation of Singapore Broadcasting Authority and later, yeah, the formation of Media Development Authority. So MDA actually still exists today. It continues to, yeah, I guess be a regulator of the media industry in Singapore as a whole. I will talk about it in a while, right? But Media 21 later morphed into something else that was called the Media Fusion Plan. In fact, it's very similar in many ways, but there are, I guess, key yeah, key focal points, right, of the SMFP, which is the Singapore Media Fusion Plan. So the Singapore Media Fusion Plan still had that very, yeah, I guess, grand vision to develop Singapore as what they by now don't call a hub, but they call it a media cluster, right? They wanted to develop Singapore as a media cluster where a lot of, I guess, digital media facilities and talent would gather. And under the SMFP, yeah, I mean, Singapore saw the incoming of many international media firms like Koei, Lucasfilm, Electronic Arts, and games company like Ubisoft. Yeah, it's also, as you can see, actually aligned with one of the key trusts here, which is to actually develop media talent, right? And with that, DigiPen Institute of Technology came to Singapore during this under this media fusion plan, right? But scholars like Terence Lee, right, who's a friend from Murdoch University, he also pointed out how actually SMFP, because of this sort of neoliberal and economical vision of media development, right? They did not always, I guess, reconcile these developments with local demands. For instance, a lot of funding media projects, right, that's commissioned or are sort of, of interest to these international firms, they may not always reconcile with what, the local population is interested and actually is demanding. And SMFP, I think it's also the reason why I mentioned it is because it's one of the key visions, right? Key plans that also looked into the development of the digital, right? So under this plan, the IDA, which is the Infocom Authority Development Authority, was also formed to work on actually really getting broadband into every home, and also strengthening the reliability and security of our telecommunications network. So fast forward, right, to the beginning of 2000s, right, the MDA, right, so just to paint a picture for all of you, right, so you can imagine what the ecology is like. The MDA continues to regulate all broadcast media. So the television, the films and radio, even like newspapers and magazines, right? They continue to be regulated under MDA. So to disseminate, to get published, right, one needs to apply for a license from MDA in order to be published. Right, foreign media, they are actually allowed, right? BBC is here, New York Times is here, but some of them actually have been banned, right? This is the classic example is the Far Eastern Economic Review, which has been banned since 2009, right? Just a show of hands, how many know about this case? No, right? But it was banned and it continues to be banned because of a particular article, right? Which I guess offended the then Prime Minister of Singapore, and he sued FEER, Far Eastern Economic Review, for defamation. So because of that article, right, FEER has been banned from being circulated in Singapore. I think, I think my third point has been well established, right? The media has always been seen as a resource and a key part of nation building in Singapore. But because of IDA, right? The IDA, right, if you remember, IDA was actually working on broadband penetration, getting people connected and so on. They were actually quite successful. So I don't know about the broadband penetration rate in Taiwan, but at the beginning of 2010, right, household broadband penetration in Singapore was at actually 82%. What this means is that 82% of all resident households in Singapore has access to the broadband network, right? And by now, smartphone adoption and smartphone ownership is actually more than 100% as well. This means that more than, on average, one individual can own more than one device and network. Sorry, scratchy throat. Sorry, I was coughing. So. So yeah, talking about the internet, right? This is really my start of my discussion of new media. So given that, now, if you can imagine, every household has broadband, and alongside Singapore's development in education, people are getting, actually everyone's, increasing in terms of their literacy, not just written, and reading literacy, but also digital literacy, right? It also means that there's a lot of use, and I would say sometimes creative use of the internet. Right. At the beginning, I think of 2000s, right? The Singapore government's approach to describing, right, or rather the Singapore's government description of their approach to the internet has always been described as quote unquote light touch, right? What does that mean? It means we will touch it, but we will not meddle too much with it. We will not stir the waters too much, right? It also means that they will leave it pretty much alone, right? Unless something serious really happens, right? Something that harms an individual, right, or a group, right? Then they will meddle, right? That's always been kind of the direction, right, of their so-called light touch approach. Yeah, but I think talking about the media and the internet, right? I think before I delve further on talking about the internet and their implications, right? I want to also pause here to, I guess, reflect on Singapore's, the Singapore government relationship with the media, right? At this point, right? And this is the beginning of 2000s, right? When, if you can imagine, right, all the mainstream media, they have been regulated. They are like, those that are allowed to operate, they have been licensed, right? Uh, yeah, a lot of, I mean, the major media companies, institutions in Singapore, they are also state-owned, or yeah, where the state actually holds a major partnership and major share, right, as well, right, or state-owned or enterprises actually own a major stake in many of these media institutions, right? So at the beginning of 2000s, right, I think the way the government actually saw the internet was always, oh, that's just another platform, right? It's okay to have this light touch, right, approach. But I also want to say that I think, and this code says it all, right? In terms of the relationship between that the government had, right, the PAP-led government has with the mainstream media. It's always been, I guess, like this, right? And I quote Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong in 1987, right, where he said, rather than freedom of the press from government, the approach in Singapore is freedom of government from the press, right? What this means is that the government would like to deliberate, do its work without having to perform in front of the media, having to stop its work to answer questions coming from the media, right? So it is, oops, sorry, I accidentally stopped my screen. Yeah, so it is a very different, I think, kind of, it's important to recognize this different vision of media government relationship that's actually happening in Singapore, right? Okay, I'd like to, I guess, just pause here and ask if there are questions, because I know this is actually very complex. And maybe something quite different from what you're all used to. Any questions? No? Okay. If not, I will move on, right? So let me, I guess, move forward, right, and talk about new media, right? What exactly is new media? I think of new media, in many ways, right? It is about the technologies, the platforms, but new media to me is also about the behaviors that's actually associated with using these platforms as well. So yeah, I think one of the major new media platforms, right, that's actually been very influential in Singapore in the yeah, almost the whole decade, right, of 2000s, will be blogs, right? If I can think of one thing, one platform that was influential, right? And I think my discussion of blogs, right, I take the approach of also, I guess, recognizing that technologies, I think, should always be understood in terms of what they are displacing, right? So blogs really, I think, evolved from the personal homepages that people were developing at the beginning of, I think, the 1990s, right, with the internet, right? And blogs became a lot more powerful in terms of the kinds of descriptions, the kind of stories, and the kinds of visuals they can put forward, right? And it became mainstream as well, right, by the mid 2000s, right? And with the growth of blogs, was also the rise of opinion expression, and people were also deliberating policies, right, online in the 2000s in Singapore, right? In terms of affordances, right? I think it's interesting to pause here to reflect on the affordances of blogs a little bit, because it's not like Facebook, right? Blogs are actually what I call narrow casting platform. It means that unlike broadcasting, where you have a mainstream media, right, that's broadcasting content to maybe millions of viewers, blogs is a bit like broadcasting as well, but with a much narrower audience, right? The content will be curated somewhat, right, for that narrower audience. And that's why I call it narrowcasting, right? And I think there's a lot of, I mean, one of my friends, Crystal Aberdeen, she does a lot of work on influencers and social media, right? And a lot of her work actually has been on how influencers use Instagram. But to me, the rise of influencers really came through, in the age of blogs, right, where individuals started to make a name for themselves, right, through them posting a blog post every day, right? And because of the media, or rather because of the political context of Singapore, opposition parties in particular, they were also using blogs a lot in Singapore, right, to engage, not just engage followers online, but also put out alternative policy suggestions. And also, some of them will also be using these blogs to question, the ruling parties' decisions here and there, right? This is really important, right? When you look at, actually try to understand the implication of new media, right? In Singapore, I think it's important to recognize how new media like blogs, right, has actually been really influential in helping these alternative views actually get surfaced, right? Bearing in mind that the mainstream media, they are all actually quite regulated. There's a lot of, I guess, curation and control over what kinds of rhetoric is published, as well as the fact that actually in Singapore, the same political party has won every election since 1959, right? Which is the People's Action Party. So yeah, I mean, so naturally, right? Especially opposition parties and activists, they began to see new media as really the platform they can tap into, right? To just surface discussions, engage followers, and grow their influence, right? I will talk about actually new media ecology a bit, right? In through a number of key events, right? And I must acknowledge, right? There has been a lot of key events, right, in Singapore, where new media has played an important role. But this is actually arguably politics, right, is the one context I feel that really would change policy, right? Would change, or rather introduce policies that would shape the media environment very much, right? Let me come to 2006, right? And in 2006, Singapore had a general election, right? Let me actually also talk about how voting is compulsory in Singapore, right? Unlike many other countries like the United States, right, where voting is not compulsory, right? So political participation and how well you engage, politics, or how well you engage with policy, national policy, right, can somewhat be measured by whether or not you show up at the ballot booth. But in Singapore, that's not the case, because voting is compulsory, right? Everyone has to vote. There's no real punishment if you don't vote, right? But you may have to forego your right to vote, right? After if you've been given a ballot card and you don't show up, right? So voting is actually rates, right? It's actually very, very high in Singapore, but that's actually not a true measure of participation. And in going into the 2006 general election, the ruling party, PAP, actually announced that what they call explicitly political content, right? Involving newer technologies like podcasting and video streaming, quote unquote prohibited, right? So yeah, you can see the attitude towards new media here, right? Where it was seen as a no-no, right? No use of podcast, video streaming like YouTube or even blogs to discuss politics at all, right? And then right? And the other thing about elections in Singapore is that it's usually very short, right? From the moment the parliament is dissolved and the time when the campaign ends and people have to vote, right, is usually very short. Sometimes it's like 1 week, sometimes it's 2 weeks, right? But it's never like a year-long campaign like the United States. And then so usually right on the time from the time that the parliament is dissolved, right, and people are nominated to run for election, right, usually a few days later people have to uh, yeah, actually vote, right, go to the booth and vote, right. It's very short campaign period. So what happened during this time, right? There was a what we call the James Gomez saga. He's actually an academic. He was based in Sydney, I think, but he's always been Singaporean. But during the 2006 election, he came back to Singapore to run for an election under an opposition party. So what happened was that on nomination day, when people had to go to the nomination center and nominate themselves as a political candidate, right? What happened with him was that he actually had to file this form, right? Which I think he forgot that he had completed but didn't submit, right? So when the elections officer said that, oh, your documentation's not complete, he kind of got frustrated, right, and accused of the election officer that he of actually neglecting his paperwork and so on, right? Eventually, right, to cut the long story short, right, people realized that I mean, he himself realized that it was a mistake because they had a camera, right, security camera at the center where they showed him, here, you completed this form and you put it back in your briefcase. You didn't send it to the election officer. He actually then apologized, right? Yeah, he apologized to the election officer, but it's still he still had a police report made against him, right? And he was investigated for criminal intimidation because he was accused of being threatening towards the elections officer, right? And there was a coverage by mainstream media for a week, right? Yeah, all the major newspapers, radio, right? They talk about this James Gomez being investigated and so on. But at the same time, various PAP leaders, right, they were also making comments, right? So this is one classic one from Lee Kuan Yew himself, right, where he said, when I comment openly, you're a liar, you're honest, and you do not dare to sue me, there's something basically wrong. And I will repeat it anywhere, and you can't go, oh, I have apologized, let's move on, and so on, right? So to cut the long story short, people were not letting him go, right, of this, right? But eventually the police let him off with a stern warning, right? He wasn't charged. Okay, then, yes, Trisha. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Yeah, James has came to NCCU and for 2 times in 2018 and 2019. And the first time you shared some like disinformation studies and politics in South Asia, I think. And the second time is I think similar topic because he is the director of the Asian Center, Asian Media Center, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Just to give some background.
Yeah,
he also
yeah.
came to Taiwan.
Oh, I didn't know he came to Taiwan.
And our university for
to
2
NCCU
times.
some more. That's very good. Should have asked him about this. Yeah, but he was at the the center stage, right, of this whole drama.
No,
yeah,
yes.
and I mean and if you all recall, right, this was the 2006 election when people have have been told nobody is supposed to actually make what they call persistently political content. In other words, don't talk about elections, right? During this time, right? Not using any kinds of new media technologies. But then we have Mr. Brown. So for some context, right? Mr. Brown is the, I guess, earliest, I mean, people call him blog father, but he was the earliest blogger, right? And sort of, uh, yeah, an individual, right, who made use of new media very much, right? He began with blogs. Later, he moved on to create a podcast, right? These days, he has a YouTube channel, and he has a Mr. Brown show. So he's been actually doing this for a very long time, since the internet began, right? Became popularized in Singapore. So Mr. Brown is also very creative. He came up with what he called the persistently non-political podcast, right? So notice the play on his words, because going into the 2006 election, people have been told, don't be persistently political, right? So he came up with a show name, right? Where he called himself the persistently non-political podcast. And look at the way, right? Before I play you this podcast, right? Let me talk about the way he made it non-political, right? While still talking about politics, right? So he basically created a satire. And he had political aspirant Jeff Lopez, right, instead of James Gomez, right? Jeff Lopez, right, the man and his ideas, right, goes for lunch, and he finds himself embroiled in a controversy, focuses the spotlight on his very integrity and credibility. So the entire show is really funny. It's about Jeff Lopez going to a hawker store, right? It's a food store in Singapore, right? To buy noodles, right? And he says, right? Jeff Lopez says, "Uncle, right? Can I have these noodles, right?" And the hawker person prepared his noodles, and then then the podcast featured Jeff Lopez saying, "Oh, I said I don't want this, right?" But then the hawker says, "No, you didn't say so," right? So basically, he had actually a play on exactly what happened in the James Gomez saga, right? To actually comment on how trivial that saga is, that so-called event is, and how we should all move on, right? So Mr. Brown, I would credit him as one of the first persons in Singapore to get away with creating content, right, that's actually political, while being told that you're not allowed to be political, right? I will just I guess share this very quickly. Okay, I think I have to do the computer sound again. Let me, yeah. Okay, I must apologize to all of you, right? It's actually heavily, in Singapore slang, Singapore English, right? If you need explanation, let me know.
One bak chor mee, please. Mee pok ta, mai hiam.
Sorry, bak chor mee means mincemeat noodle, right?
Wait, hang on. This has tu kwa in it. Yeah lah. It's
Te kwa means I think it means pork liver. Okay. You get the idea. He was really using, I mean, even for me hearing it again is still funny, because the whole episode, I think it's actually replaying that whole exchange between James Gomez and members of the ruling party as well. So but beyond Mr. Brown's show, right, there were also many other internet users that actually were creatively creating memes, right, that were so-called tiptoeing around that persistently political guideline, right? There were a lot of, I guess, a lot of use of the internet, podcast, right? Be it podcast, blogs, right? And so on to circumvent, right? To still talk about the elections and what was happening in the elections, still talk about policies and deliberate on it, right? Without getting caught, right? But I think this is actually significant, right? And I think this also shows how, right, policies are not set in stone, right? Sometimes the way we actually respond to policy and the way we use new media can change policy too, because after the internet, the PAP-led government, right, they made a U-turn in terms of how they will approach new media, right, after this particular election, right, in a post-election conference in 2006, right, you have actually the Prime Minister saying we will use new media, multimedia, podcast, broadcast, all these things which you get in the internet or somebody sends you by mail, right? Our ministries, agencies, they have to experiment, they have to try it out, right? So the directive actually came from the top, right? And actually this marked the beginning of what you would later see, right? Of how politicians in Singapore began actually using the internet, right? Especially those from the ruling party. But it also triggered a regulatory change, right? Because by the 2011 general election, regulations were updated to allow citizens, political commentators, scholars to use the internet and talk about actually comment on the elections during the campaign. Yeah, the only exception is cooling off day, right? Where just right before, just one day before people were supposed to go to the booth and vote. They had a cooling off day where nobody is supposed to be campaigning or posting anymore, right? So that's actually the implications post 2006 election, right? In 2011, the hawker theme continues, right? And in 2011, the general election, right? It's always marked as actually one of the most significant elections in Singapore, where the one particular opposition party, the Workers' Party, began to gain traction, right? So by traction, I still mean, right, that the government is still led by PAP, right? It's just that there's by now more, by the end of the 2011 election, more seats actually were won by the Workers' Party, right? And the hawker team continue, more dramas emerge, right? When they were fiercely contesting one particular constituency, right? And back then when Lee Kuan Yew was still alive, right? He made this very strong statement where he says, right? You, if Arjunic voters, right? Arjunic is that hotly contested area, really do have the temerity to vote out the PAP, they will have 5 years to live and repent. Right? I think Trisha remember this. So then and again you see the more I guess pop culture content, more memes, more podcasts, right, that were created to actually respond to what Lee Kuan Yew was saying, right? This one I like in particular, right, where he actually used the tegua, right, which is one of the meat that was contested in the 2006 election, right? And he used this to say, he drew this very cute figure to say, you will live to repent, I tell you, repent, right? So, this tegua, which is pork liver, right, image, right, was produced and disseminated, right? People were downloading it and using it as their wallpaper and theme for 2011 election. And then back then for the 2011 election, I was also studying the continuation of how people were using blogs to deliberate on policies and agenda in Singapore, right? So one thing that I found was that the blogs were actually doing this role in terms of setting alternative agenda and topics that were not identified as so-called important, right, or significant by mainstream media or or even commentators, right? They were being surfaced through a lot of these discussions that were happening in blogs. But I think there was also, I think back then I also noticed a lot of, I guess, intolerance, right, of alternative discourse. Yeah, and we can talk more about that later. But I think right now, right, a lot of the so-called problems that we see with new media, right, is not something that I think is only came about in recent years, right? What I'm trying to say is that a lot of these polarization, this identity politics, right, actually started very early, right? But what are the implications? Post 2011 election, right? In 2013, the MDA updated the class licensing scheme, right? And this time, right, they now require what they call online news sites that report regularly on issues relating to Singapore, and they have a definition of what they call significant reach, right, to require an individual license. So what this means is that if you are news sites, you report or even if you're a blog site, right, but if you report regularly on Singapore, on issues relating to Singapore, and you have a significant reach, right, you are required to apply for an individual license. Before this, there's no need to, right? People who are running a lot of these blog sites, they were just, regarded as internet sites. But if you have enough of a reach, right, then you have to apply for an individual license, right? You're also required to comply with an internet code of practice developed by the MDA. And part of this compliance, right, also includes prohibitions in terms of content, right? Especially for instance, content that MDA feels is actually undermining racial or religious harmony, right? And along with all these licensing, right, you are also required to put up a performance bond of $50,000. So a lot of these actually requirements, right, I would say actually would not be very difficult, right, for many of the blog sites. But that 50,000 is actually prohibitive because many of them actually are not full-fledged businesses, right? They may be freelancers, they may be like maybe collectives of individuals, they are just running these blog sites, right? So this move actually resulted in the closure of many socio-political blogs like the Breakfast Network, which is actually something that was started by a veteran journalist, Berta Hansen. And she left her journalistic practice to start a Breakfast Network. But because of this, actually she later said in an interview it was mainly the $50,000 that she couldn't comply with, right? And in response to these new media licensing regulations, bloggers went on to start a series of protests, right? They went to Hong Lim Park to protest against this new class licensing scheme. They also started an internet movement, hashtag Free My Internet, right? Every now and then, in fact, if you search for hashtag Free My Internet, you might still be able to find that from time to time, right? Since 2013, there has been posts about this internet regulation, right? That has been posts protesting this particular internet regulation. So, okay, I know all of you are overdue for a break, right? So again, this is actually free for all discussion, right? But I'd like you to think about two questions during your break. Sorry to make you work while you relax. But I think these two questions are interesting, right? My first question is, does new media always imply greater democratization? Right? In what way is this true, right? Given that what I've shared, right, in the context of Singapore, where I guess because of the internet and newer media technologies like podcasting, you do see actually the surfacing, the emergence of more alternative discourse and debates, right? So in a way, I think that is true, right? But I would like you to also think about in what ways, right, this new media does not always imply greater democratization, right? I can share more, right? We can, when we come back, we can discuss more, both in the context of Singapore, as well as, I guess, in your own cultural context as well, right? My second question is, how does new media work as part of the media environment, right? What are the conflicts and tensions? Where are the alignments? Right. Let me give you an example of conflicts and tension, right? If you go back to my slide, right? So I just give you an example so you know what you're supposed to come up with and discuss, right? So if I go back to this slide, if you remember, right? I talked about actually the government, the social political context in Singapore, and the government's relations with media up until this point, right? Beginning of 2000s and all that. In fact, up until this point, right, the internet has always been seen as a way to grow Singapore's economy. It's supposed to contribute to our gross domestic product, and that's why the government has always been very progressive in pushing out all these developments and encouraging people to adopt broadband and so on, right? But I think there is a certain conflict, right? Because with the adoption of the internet also comes a greater variety in terms of its use, more information that's coming through as well when with more and more content that's coming up, right? One example of conflict, right, and tension is that the ruling government no longer has a lot of control over the content, right? So that's one example of a conflict and tension, right? I guess in terms of the sort of neoliberal economic development, there is alignment, right? Because greater adoption of the internet did actually, in Singapore's case, has contributed to the development and of Singapore, right, as a media cluster, has also, I guess, brought in all these businesses and investment they so wanted, right? As well. So when we come back after 10 minutes, right, I'd like you to, I guess, talk about this. Sorry, I have too many animation. Yeah, talk about this second question as well. How does new media work as part of the media environment, right? What are the conflicts, tensions, and what are the alignments, right? Any questions? Okay, so I will start my timer, right? So please enjoy your break and sorry for overrunning again, but I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, I think you guys can see my screen. I'm learning about Teams today. All right, okay, let's, in the interest of time, maybe I'll just have one person, I guess, reflect on each question. Any thoughts about the first question? So just to recap, before the break, I invited all of you to think about two questions, right? Does new media always imply greater democratization, right? In what way do you agree with this statement, right? Do you think that's true, right? And in what ways do you actually disagree with this statement? Do you think that's not true, right? Let's have people who have not shared, right? Any volunteers, right? If you have not actually shared before.
Okay, I'll try.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Sophia.
Yeah. So the first question, does new media always imply greater democratization? So I think.
Sophia, sorry to interrupt. Do you want to switch on your video? I think you forgot to switch on. People can't see you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I think that the entire COVID has actually brought about many opportunities for collaboration, especially online on the virtual space. For example, there have been many grown-up initiatives that have emerged because of the need on the ground, and these have actually helped to reach populations that have been otherwise difficult to reach. Like for example, migrant workers and workers in dormitories isolated, and there have been NGOs who actually use these technologies like Zoom to connect, and Zoom and WhatsApp, Facebook as well, to connect to the workers on the ground and to find out their needs and communicate. So I think this is actually a way which I don't know if I'm answering the question, but like a form of, even as a form of social activism, not just to give the migrant workers a voice, but also use it to channel it to a greater good for the community. In what ways is this untrue? Okay, I think there's many ways in which it's untrue as well. For example, cancel culture. My personal sentiments is that sometimes when people talk about issues that can be sensitive, for example, things related to identity politics, it's very easy for a certain comment to create to evoke a response, and for people to actually say that, oh, you are not listening to the voices of the minority, you are not being you're not listening, and it creates a lot of backlash. I think that also happened to J.K. Rowling and even like many other people as well, even though there have been good things that have happened, like for example the Me Too movement. But I would say like the use of new media is always a double-edged sword, and it really depends on the context in which people use it.
Yeah. Thank you, Sophia. I really like your points about context. And I think it's very true. Whether or not new media actually always will lead to the greater democratization. To me, it depends on the settings that are being used. Right. I like your example of migrant workers. Right. I know you also do quite a lot of volunteer work with the migrant workers group in Singapore. So I appreciate your sharing about how, new media, I guess, provides a way for otherwise unheard voices to be surfaced, right? So in a sense, that's actually democratization, right, of the information as well as needs, right? I have a lot to say about cancel culture, but I will not digress. But I also take your point that, the communication settings, the context by which we use this new media, newer forms of media, right, can also limit its effects, right? Anyone has anything to add?
We have one here.
Yes.
I wanted to talk about the first question, like in the beginning, that I think whether it is true or not depends on how much or to what extension can people use the new media. Like for example, if there are regulations as mentioned above, then even though the new media technology is improving and progressing, then if people cannot use it, then that is when it is untrue, I think.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you. I didn't catch your name. Are you
My
Lorna?
name is Ming Ming.
She can be named.
Okay.
So you can have a
Ming
show.
Ming. Yeah, Lorna is sitting on the other side, right? Yeah. Thanks, Ming Ming. I really like your point. I think it gives us a nice segue to the second question, which I'll just jump on, right, in the interest of time. So you talked about, just to recap for everyone that's online who may not be able to hear so clearly, right? So you talked about, whether or not it can be used effectively, the way it was designed to be, right? Also depends on, I guess, not just the people, but also the environment that informs the way whether or not what they can use things for, right? So that is a certain conflict and tension, right? Because even though, actually, I think many media platforms, internet-based platforms, that have been designed to be used in this way or that, right? it can come into conflict, right, with the way I guess actually authorities, the people, institutions actually understand what they can use it for, right? So sometimes that is in conflict, right? Because of these well-established and historical developments, right? And that is why I wanted to, I guess, introduce the topic by really focusing a lot on actually introducing the context, right? Introducing the development of Singapore's media environment, right? Which has been very much driven in a top-down way, and also very much, I guess, governed by policies, right? That may not actually be aligned with the designs and affordances of new media. Yeah. Okay, thank you. That was excellent. Okay, I will not talk about Facebook, right, and its growth and so on, because I think all of you are experts, right? You probably know Facebook better than I do, but I do want to talk about Facebook as an example of new media, and in particular the features of Facebook and how it informs the way people use them, right? And in the next case I'm going to talk about actually is, I guess, the use of Facebook by activists and civil society group in one case, right, that has risen in importance over the years, right? So some of the features of Facebook is actually what I call mass personal. Facebook is a social network. It's not I guess if we compare it to platforms like Twitter, I tend to think of it as a social network as well. But Twitter is also a micro broadcasting platform, right? You go to Twitter when you have something to announce and so on. People do that kind of announcements on Facebook as well, but it's actually more to their own social network. Although there is that potential for Facebook to be what I would describe as mass personal as well. So it's not just personal communication, because your post can also be potentially broadcasted to other people. But the first line of context, right, is always the fact that it's a social network. So yeah, talking about the network, right, a lot of news, other content, right, is also disseminated based on the network, right? If I want to see like the post of someone in the room, for instance, right, maybe you may be posting about this class, right, and whether or not you've wasted my time here, your time with me, right, I will not be able to see your post unless I am in some way connected with your network, right? So this is what I mean by network-based dissemination of news and other content. So in a way, my influence on Facebook is also very much based on that network, right? I am influential only as far as my network and the network of my networks actually see me as influential. It is not like Twitter that has every tweet that is public, right? And yeah, I don't need to be connected to J.K. Rowling's network to be able to see his or to be able to see her tweets, and likewise, yeah, Obama and so on. So so these are actually key features of Facebook, which is important to bear in mind, right, as I talk about the next case, right? And this is another case of I mean, I'm going to talk about Bukit Brown as a cemetery, right, and the case around Bukit Brown. And I picked this case, right, not just because it's been prominent in shaping how Singapore society actually engage in civic activism. But it's also been prominent personally for me because I've been, I guess, engaged in this case personally as well. As first as a researcher, later, yeah, because of my work on it, I became part of Singapore Heritage Society. So I got involved in civil society because of this case. Yeah, so let me talk about the issue here, right? As you all know, Singapore is very land scarce. Land is very precious to us, right? So development has always been, I would say, at the forefront and yeah, prioritized as our agenda, right? So this means that every now and then you see a cemetery being removed, you see a park being kind of redeveloped into either an industrial park or a housing residential area and so on. So Bukit Brown is not spared. Bukit Brown Cemetery is not spared from it, as well. But what is so significant about this cemetery is that it is one of the largest. It is also the first public municipal cemetery in Singapore. So before this public municipal status, right? If you died in Singapore, right, in the early 1800s and so on, you will have to belong to some association in order to be buried. Right. So Bukit Brown is actually became a public space for the dead. Right. Imagine that. It's like a public sphere for the dead. Right. But with the public municipal status, right, so long as you are resident in Singapore, you don't have to belong to some clan association to be buried in Singapore. So as a result, right, as a cemetery, the whole area has actually quite a lot of very prominent pioneers that can tell us many things about Singapore, right? From the graves and so on. But what happened in 2011, right? So this was also right after the election, right? If you recall, in 2011, yeah, people were using the internet so much to engage in the politics. They were criticizing yeah, the government so much, right? In 2011 as well, right? So you must remember this context as I explain this case, right? So in 2011, at the end of 2011, towards the end, right, there was an announcement from the government to say we will start building this four-lane carriageway, right? That will be completed by 2016. It will cut across Bukit Brown, right? The red mark area, as you can see here in this map, right, highlights all the construction of the road. And this map actually came from one of the activists around Bukit Brown, right? One of the people who has been actually paying visits to cemeteries to learn about pioneers and all that. Very interesting. So so on this map, right, other than highlighting the road, what he had done is also highlight like the key sites that are threatened, right, and that are at the risk of removal from the road. Right. I can say more about these cultural aspects of the case, but yeah, given that today's topic is on new media, let me move on. Right. So what were people doing? Eventually, this group called Bukit Brownies, right, or All Things Bukit Brown emerged. Right. They were doing a lot of volunteer work. They were doing a lot of research, documentation. But yeah, I will talk about like how they use new media in a while. Right. In terms of how they do this research. They were also doing a lot of voluntary cleaning work. A lot of these cemeteries, they were left, they have been forgotten. So they were left untouched, right? So a lot of these volunteers, they were going into the cemetery, cutting the grass and cleaning the tombs, doing research about it. And they also organize tours, right? That are still running until today, right? So it's been 10 years, right, since they started this activism, right? So they also go to forgotten pioneers, right, and they try to like unearth, literally dig them out from the forest, right, and educate the public about them. Now you may wonder why is this contentious, right? So let me go to this slide to explain, right? So when the government actually announced this road, there was an uproar, right? Because and by now, you know, bearing in mind that people now understand how to use Facebook and blogs, right, to generate discourse, people were using a lot of both platforms, blogs, Facebook. Twitter is not so well used in Singapore, right? But although that is changing, but in 2011, it wasn't well used. People were using blogs, mini blogs, and Facebook to protest what was happening here, right? And the Singapore Heritage Society, which is a civil society group that represent heritage interests, right? They sort of made a public statement about the need to keep Bukit Brown. There was also, I guess, a major tension with the PAP-led government as well, because, yeah, the way the government engaged and consulted civil society was just not very forthcoming, right? But again, I think context, right? It all matters. Yeah, I mean, engagement of civil society, or even just how to consult civil society, right, is actually fairly new in Singapore, right? As a nation, right, Singapore has not had a lot of practice in terms of how to do that, right? This is something I think that's quite interesting, and we can, when we have time, I think we can discuss more about that. But that's my topic next week, right? So there was a lot of actually this tension that was happening in the background, but the brownies, who are all the volunteers, right, they were using new media a lot, right, to not just conduct tours and walks, right. On the left you see an example of the tours, right. I was also involved in the research and documentation. My area is all about digital humanities, so I was going to the graves and digitally creating replicas and doing digital documentation of the tomb layouts from the using aerial photography and so on. That's me, right? Doing a tour, a talk in the library, right? So doing part of this public outreach and education as well, right? And at the bottom, right, you have a picture of the exhibition that we also organized after the documentation project. So so how did we do activism, right? So this is, I think, really where a lot of convergence of practices also came together, right? With Facebook, right? I think we use this is an example of like using Facebook to actually seek information, right? There's a lot of research that we can gather from the archives and all that, but there's always like missing gaps, right? That we have to plug. So the volunteers, for instance, they were posting pictures like this, right? Peranakan Tau, they found at a tomb, right? They were asking for information, and Facebook was used as a platform for people to actually just come forward with information, crowdsourcing, if you like, right? Crowdsourcing information. A lot of the, I think, activism is also relational, right? And this is interesting because I think I think in this particular case, there's also multiple networks, right? What I'm showing you here is just like the social network of one group, right? All things Bukit Brown, right? And I think what's interesting here is just how relational it is, in terms of the affordances Facebook offered, right? So if you can see, right, all of you are experts of Facebook, so right? So if you belong to a page, right, like All Things Bukit Brown, you'll also be able to see, oh, who else in your network belong to All Things Bukit Brown. So in that way, you discover new networks, right? And you also discover, oh, this other friend is also in this group, right? Let me connect with him and organize something together. So my point being made here is that Facebook was also used by a lot of these the people who were involved in All Things Bukit Brown to not just discover new networks that they can join that's related to either the topic of Bukit Brown or heritage, but also connect with people they didn't know, right? Who are their friends, but they didn't know, were also part of All Things Bukit Brown, and then they make connections to actually start organizing and mobilize together. So, this is, I think, reflects convergence in many ways as well, right? The last is very, I guess, very much about opinion expression, right? Which is, something that the activists were also using, right? So this post is one example, right, of how activists also use Facebook to express their opinions about Bukit Brown, right? And I think this is also interesting to reflect on, because the expression of opinions, right, may be different, right? The opinions expressed by one particular group, right, may be different from another group, right? So the question in the age of new media is, do actually new media facilitated mobilization always need to see a common understanding and agreement of what we are fighting for, right? What we are advocating and mobilizing for, right? I think the answer is no, but I'll get to that more of that next week. Yeah, but yeah, this is just a note to say that was happening, right? I think one other very interesting thing, right? I've talked about actually blogs. I've talked about Facebook as newer forms of media, but sometimes we forget, right? Google Maps, right, is also part of our new media ecology and landscape. So if you remember, right, the government was actually arguing that, oh, we need to construct this road because this particular highway is very congested with the traffic and so on, right? But this is an example of how citizens, right, and these are actually not activists, right? They are just everyday citizens. They use Google actually maps, right? Traffic analysis, right? To analyze traffic of new media or of traffic around Bukit Brown, right? So in a very creative way, I think this is their way of checking the statement made by the government agency. Right, they were checking whether it's true, whether or not it's true that there is this serious traffic jam, and whether or not this removal of this construction of the road was really necessary. So let me actually, I guess, spend the next few minutes reflect on what this means, right? So to me, this is actually uh, this example really demonstrates how new media can be used by everyday citizens, right? As a form of resistance, right? This kind of resistance is not, done in a very, I guess, confrontational way, right? It is actually kind of aligned with the socio-political landscape of Singapore, right? But they were using actually Google traffic analysis of roads around Bukit Brown, right? To at the same time, other than actually challenging the official statement, but it was also at the same time engaging the public, right? In a more, I guess, more on the topic of nostalgia, more on the topic of whether or not we need all this development around us, right? So a lot of these kinds of that examples, right, of using newer media, right, like Google, like One Map, right, like Maps, Google Satellite, right, was used to actually do this kind of reflection and at the same time resistance, right? So what does it actually imply? I think what's also interesting is that if you think about a cemetery, right? A cemetery is actually a very private place, right? If I ask all of you, would you go into and visit like a cemetery, where you have no ancestors buried? I think the answer is no, right? How many of you would do that? I think except for the very curious and or unless you want to look for ghosts or something, right? You will not ever visit a cemetery, right? That especially if you don't have ancestors buried there. But what I've seen over the past 10 years of actually following this case, researching on Bukit Brown and working as part of civil society, is that it has also created an expansion of a community around Bukit Brown, right? And I call this expanded community the third line, right? If I think about the cemetery, right, usually there are only two lines, right? The first line is, actually the first line will be your friends and relatives, right, who form that first ring of support around someone that is dead, right? So literally that's the first line, right? And you have the second line that's usually all the people that support your visit, your worship, right? At the cemetery, right? And this will be examples of this will be the tomb keepers, the people who actually help sell you supplies that you carry to the cemetery and so on. The third line is never really around, right? Until the emergence of new media, right? And I think this third line is actually really interesting because it can be very expandable, but at the same time very broad as well, right? It is actually, these are all the online participants who join the network of activists, right? And this third line actually they do a lot of things, right? They use Google Maps, right, to check on statements. They actually post a lot of images, right? They do a lot of this kind of checking of images, and they offer information as well, right? I think what all these do is really also, I guess, change just how the public actually engage in a topic like this, right? Something that is otherwise very private and I guess focused to a core group of heritage enthusiasts, right? And people who are interested in cultural heritage, right? So I think my time is running out, right? I have about 10 minutes left. So I will end on this note, right? To I guess summarize, right? I have given through a series of case studies, I give you examples of how the media environment actually has evolved over the years, right? Since our independence in Singapore, right? I hope by now you also have gained a good understanding of how context informs new media use and development. But also, right, on this note, how actually new media can be used to connect with and also used to support national discourse and national identity. So I have, I want to spend the next 5 minutes or so, right, talking about the after class activity, which I'll post in a bit, right? So this is actually similar to what I asked all of you to do after your first break, right? I'd like you to think of any example of cultural media production. So yeah, for those who have actually already posted your link, right, you can just use the same link, right? But if you like, right, you can also think about examples of citizen use of new media, right, that have shaped your understanding or experience as citizen, right? So I think the first example you understand, right? The second example, right, will be this one, for instance, right, where citizens use Google traffic analysis to make people rethink, right, a public statement, right, and make people rethink whether or not a development was necessary, right? So that's an example of actually citizen use of new media, right, that may actually shape public discourse, right? And yeah, so in Moodle, right, I will post that after class activity, right? Just post the link to it, right, and write a short reflection of no more than 200 to 300 words on any one of the following, right? So you can just choose one, right? So if you post, let me use Lucas' example, right? Post that, where he shared that wonderful trailer to that very fascinating movie, right? So he, for instance, could post that link, right, and write about how it connected with this course that was going on about the war and depiction of the facts, right, and how understandings of it actually may be different within Germany and outside, right? So you could also be sharing about that same firm, right, but more in terms of the affordances of media and its implications, right? What are the affordances of it as a firm, right? What are the implications in terms of its impact and how it shaped, right, people's, I guess not just people's understanding of it, but also how it may connect with their experiences, own life experiences as well. Or you could be posting that link and actually focus your reflection on how it connects with nation building discourse or national identity, right? Is this any questions about this? I hope this is clear. Yeah, Trisha, yeah, any questions? Sorry, I think it's muted. Sophia and Lucas, any questions? No.
So this will be on the new e-Moodle. So so DataPen will post the question over there. You guys can post your reflections and can interact with each other.
Yeah, thanks for raising that. Yeah, you're encouraged to reply to each other as well.
Yes.
Can I just check, is the Moodle the same platform as Microsoft Teams?
Sorry, I think there's a lot of echo, Sophia. Maybe you can, yeah, okay, try again.
Is Moodle the same platform as the Microsoft team?
No, it's
Okay.
different. I think, yeah, because I think you haven't used it before. I think Andrew can will send you some instructions.
Yeah, okay. I haven't received any email from Moodle. Can.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Sophia. I will ask Moodle to send you an email.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, if not, okay. I am thinking of actually Saturday night, 2359 hours as the deadline. Is that okay? Doable?
Yeah, yeah.
Doable for everyone? Okay. Okay, that's great. That gives me at least one day to look at what you posted and reply, right? Before our Monday class. So if there are no questions, thank you all very much, and thanks for being so patient. And yeah, bearing with me through my technical difficulties. I had fun, and I hope you did too. Thank you all. See you. Yeah. Bye. Have a good lunch, Lucas.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.
Yeah, see you next week. Bye.
See you. Bye.